In this video, I'm going to start working with the glass pen on the turtle shellbone drawing on Bristol, and in fact I've already started, and it's working wonderfully. Now I'm using the larger pen that was in my glass pen video. The nibs are basically the same, but this pen was more of a challenge in that video, so I want to make sure that it works the way I want it to work. So, this is Bristol board. I've transferred my drawing. I have a little pot of water to rinse the pen if I need to, and I have a little bottle of ink that is the Pelikan drawing ink. Now, I'll show you a close-up of this when I get a little bit more done. And what I'm going to do in this video is just give you a few instructions on what to do if you're going to do it this way, and then tell you to go ahead and go for it and use stippling or the making of dots or lines or cross-hatching, whatever way that you've decided to do it, to develop the shadows in the drawing. And I'm going to be doing the same. So what I am doing right now, and so these are just recommendations of how you can work if you want to. I am going over all of my pencil lines and making little dotted lines. And I'm very glad that I switched papers. Here is a test on the other drawing paper. And it's just a little bit too big of a dot. So it was correct for me to switch to this paper. And by making dots on your lines, what you're doing is making your drawing more natural looking. Because when you look at an object, even though our brain perceives that we see the edges, we see detail, in reality, about 90% of the detail isn't really paid attention to. In other words, when you look at this turtle shell bone, you have an impression. And then your impression determines what your brain thinks about it. And when you decide that one particular area might be more interesting, that's when you would look at the detail. So by doing everything with dotted lines to begin with, you are allowing yourself to be open to your original impression. In other words, if I were using straight bold lines right now, there's only one way that drawing can go, and that's straight bold lines. By doing this in dots, I can either add lines and make areas more bold, or I can leave them as dots and make them less important, allow them to be less important. So it's really a rule of thumb, no matter what type of art you're doing, is that if you're going to outline something, you do it in dots, so that you don't limit yourself. Now, I picked up a little hair from somewhere, and of course you want to wipe your pen off. I have a rag. You want to wipe your pen off right away. Now, generally, I'm working a little bit differently all over the place right now because I had already started this. But generally, you want to start at the top left of your drawing and work to the right so that your hand doesn't smudge anything you're doing. Now I have a little bit more ink on the pen than I had a minute ago, and I'm getting darker dots, which is fine, but this is when you have to watch out for blobs. So I'm just going to do this one side not the other part of the shell. And then, if anybody is actually following this and doing something similar, you want to go ahead and, excuse me, fill in your drawing. But before you do that, before you actually go and finish the drawing, if you're working in ink, let the ink dry maybe overnight. It depends on the ink, and with this, because it's really sitting on top of the surface, I'm probably going to let this dry overnight. And then tomorrow morning I will take an eraser and remove all the pencil lines. And I want the ink to have at least until tomorrow morning to dry, so that I don't end up smudging anything, because then I'd have to start over again. But you will see that when you do that, when you get to the point of erasing everything, all of a sudden you're left with this polka dotted outline on your paper, and it actually feels positive, because then your brain starts to say, well, wait a minute, what do I need to fill in? And that is where it all starts, and how you develop the drawing as you go along. So then, after you erase it, erase the pencil lines, then go ahead and, if you're using this method, you can either use dots or lines, cross hatching, regular hatching. If you're working in graphite, it's similar, except you probably wouldn't be doing polka dots for an outline. You would just be building up the graphite. And then, of course, if you're working in any of the paints, with watercolor, you could do this either way. Pelikan ink is going to bleed even after it dries if you then apply watercolor. The only one that I have found consistently that doesn't bleed when you add watercolor is Higgins Black Magic, which is an India ink. Sumi might not, but I haven't done enough with the Sumi ink yet lately to be able to tell you whether or not that could. But you can do that with acrylic or oil or even egg tempera. You would be filling in, well, with egg you'd be filling in your strokes of color in layers and then letting them dry. Acrylic, you would probably be finishing the painting in one sitting. With oil, you might be putting initial neutral layers in and then building up the areas differently. But with pen and ink, and specifically the glass pen, so now I'm just going to stick this in the water pot, and it doesn't look like much right now, which is the fun of pen and ink. And even on this paper, the dots are a little bit bigger than I would have wanted them. With a crow quill, they would have been minuscule and almost, not microscopic, but they would have been a lot smaller. But what's under those dots is the pencil, which was quite thick because I used a number 2 pencil. So once I erase the pencil, this is going to look much lighter, and it's going to prompt me to go ahead and fill in the shadow areas. And just as a comparison, see how that was even bigger on the other paper? So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to give, I'll do this one, then I'm going to give this ink, polka dots, 24 hours to dry. I'll erase the pencil, and then I'll go ahead and build up the shadows using the glass pen, the Pelikan Drawing Ink A, and you can go ahead and do the same, and we'll see what it looks like when I get it done. Now, I already know that the sepia might be darker than I want it, because that's the actual shell. So I'm already thinking of which FW acrylic inks I may end up going over this with. And that'll be a process if you're working in ink. It used to be, with black especially, you don't want to make a mistake because you can't use white out, or you can use gouache, white gouache or Chinese white, but it's always going to show up. So the better way to guide your thinking is keeping your thinking in light and shadow, no matter what color you're working with. And I already know this will be a lighter area than all through here. So let's say I pick out 3 or 4 colors. The heaviest, thickest application of ink is going to be in the middle. And so this, I have to pretend this is almost invisible. And at the very end, go in and just add a little bit more definition in the lighter areas. But as I develop this, I'm going to have to develop this because this is like the reflected shadow area. So whatever object you're using, you're going to use a similar way of thinking to build up light and dark. But if you keep, even when you're using color, if you keep your mind set on light and dark, 90% of the time, you're going to make something that is pretty close to whatever you're drawing. Because light and dark is really what you're looking at. And there is color, obviously, even in a natural thing. There's gray, there's green, brown, a little bit of black even. But what you're really looking at is light and dark.